The wind howled through the mountains like a living thing, carrying snow that cut like glass across the frozen landscape. Commander Sarah Chun pulled her white camouflage tighter around her body as she pressed against the rocky outcrop, her breath forming small clouds that disappeared instantly in the brutal cold. The thermometer clipped to her gear read -37 degrees Fahrenheit. Christmas Eve in the Hindu Kush Mountains of Afghanistan. And she was supposed to be dead. 12 hours earlier, Sarah had been leading a 4-person SEAL team on a reconnaissance mission to identify terrorist supply routes through the mountain passes. The intelligence had been wrong. Instead of finding empty caves and hidden weapon caches, they had walked straight into a trap. 20 Taliban fighters had been waiting in positions that gave them perfect fields of fire across the narrow valley floor. The ambush happened fast. Bullets started flying from 3 different directions while her team was crossing an open area between 2 cliff faces. The first burst of automatic gunfire caught Petty Officer Rodriguez in the chest, dropping him instantly. Petty Officer Martinez dove behind a boulder and returned fire while Chief Williams tried to drag Rodriguez to safety behind better cover. Sarah had been scanning the ridgeline through her scope when the shooting started. Her training kicked in immediately. She dropped prone behind a fallen log and began identifying muzzle flashes, calling out target locations to her team through her radio headset. The enemy had chosen their position well. They controlled the high ground and had the Americans pinned down in a natural kill zone. The firefight lasted 23 minutes. Sarah counted every second of it. She watched Martinez take a round through the shoulder that spun him around and sent him sprawling. Williams kept trying to reach Rodriguez, but the enemy fire was too intense. Every time he moved from cover, bullets chewed up the ground around him and sent rock fragments flying through the air. Sarah had already taken out 3 enemy fighters when she saw the rocket-propelled grenade launcher being set up on the ridge to her left. The Taliban fighter was taking his time, lining up a shot that would eliminate her entire team in one explosion. She shifted her position and put her crosshairs on his center mass. The shot was difficult in the wind and at that range, but she had made harder ones during training. The bullet found its target, but the damage was already done. Someone else picked up the RPG and fired it before Sarah could acquire the new target. The explosion landed 15 feet from where Williams was crouched, and the concussion threw him against the cliff face like a rag doll. He did not get back up. Martinez was still conscious, but losing blood fast from his shoulder wound. Rodriguez had stopped moving completely. Sarah realized she was the only one left who could fight effectively, and there were still more than a dozen enemy fighters in positions around the valley. Her ammunition was running low, and there was no way to call for immediate extraction with the radio damaged in the blast. The situation became clear to Sarah with the cold logic that her SEAL training had drilled into her. Her team was going to die in this valley unless she did something dramatic to change the tactical picture. The enemy fighters were starting to move down from the ridges, probably planning to finish off the wounded Americans and collect their weapons and equipment. Sarah made her decision. She would create a diversion that would draw the enemy away from her teammates and give any potential rescue force a better chance of finding them alive. She gathered all the remaining ammunition from Rodriguez and Williams, checked her gear one final time, and prepared to make her move. The plan was simple but dangerous. Sarah would advance up the opposite slope under cover of the remaining daylight and establish a position where she could engage the enemy from their flank. The Taliban fighters would have to choose between maintaining their ambush positions or turning to deal with the threat she represented. Either choice would give Martinez and any other survivors a better chance. Sarah began her movement just as the sun was setting behind the western peaks. The temperature was already dropping fast, and she knew it would be well below zero before midnight. She carried everything she could: her rifle, sidearm, medical kit, survival gear, and enough ammunition for one sustained firefight. Everything else had to be left behind. The climb took her 2 hours. Sarah moved carefully, using every piece of available cover and stopping frequently to listen for signs that she had been detected. The Taliban fighters were still in their positions around the valley floor, apparently convinced that they had the situation under control. They were taking their time, probably planning to move in after full darkness fell. Sarah reached a position approximately 800 yards from the main enemy concentration just as the last light faded from the sky. She could see muzzle flashes below her as the Taliban fighters continued to fire sporadically at her team's position. The shooting told her that Martinez was still alive and fighting back, though his return fire was becoming less frequent. The attack Sarah launched from her elevated position changed everything. She began with precise shots at the enemy fighters who were most exposed, dropping two of them before the others realized they were being engaged from a new direction. The Taliban fighters started shouting to each other in Pashto, trying to coordinate a response to this unexpected threat. Sarah kept firing, moving to a new position after every few shots to avoid being located by muzzle flash. She made each bullet count, picking targets carefully and waiting for clean shots rather than wasting ammunition on suppressive fire. Her disciplined approach was working. The enemy fighters were confused and disorganized, caught between dealing with her harassment from above and maintaining their positions around her wounded teammates. But Sarah knew she could not maintain this pressure indefinitely. Her ammunition supply was finite, and the enemy would eventually figure out her general location and concentrate their fire on her position. She needed to find a way to break contact and escape before they could organize a coordinated assault on her position. The opportunity came when she saw lights approaching from the south. A convoy of 3 vehicles was making its way up the narrow mountain road that led to the valley. Sarah could not tell if they were friendly or enemy forces, but their arrival would definitely complicate the tactical situation for everyone involved. The Taliban fighters saw the lights too. Sarah watched through her scope as several of them began moving toward positions that would allow them to ambush the approaching vehicles. This was exactly the kind of confusion she needed to make her escape. While the enemy fighters were distracted by this new development, she could break contact and try to reach the vehicles before they entered the kill zone. Sarah began moving immediately, using the rocky terrain to mask her movement from the Taliban positions. She had to cover almost a mile of difficult ground in darkness while carrying all her equipment. The temperature was continuing to drop, and the wind was getting stronger. Snow began falling as she picked her way down the mountainside. The descent was treacherous in the darkness. Sarah had to feel her way over loose rocks and around drop-offs that she could barely see even with her night vision equipment. Several times, she nearly lost her footing on patches of ice that had formed in the shadows between the boulders. A fall here would mean broken bones or worse, and there would be no rescue. Sarah reached the road just as the convoy came into view around a bend in the mountain pass. She could see that the vehicles were military trucks, but she still could not identify them as friendly forces. They could be Taliban reinforcements coming to join the ambush, or they could be American forces responding to her team's missed radio check. The lead truck was moving slowly, with its headlights sweeping back and forth across the road surface. The driver was being careful on the icy pavement, probably aware that this was dangerous territory even without the active firefight that was still continuing in the valley below. Sarah could hear sporadic gunfire echoing off the mountains, though it was much less intense than it had been earlier. Sarah had to make a choice. She could try to signal the convoy and hope they were friendly forces, or she could remain hidden and let them pass while she continued trying to escape on foot. Either option carried significant risks. If the trucks contained Taliban fighters, revealing herself would likely mean immediate death or capture. But if they were American forces, this might be her only chance for rescue before the weather became completely impossible to survive. The decision was made for her when she heard English being spoken over a radio in the lead truck. The voice was discussing tactical frequencies and calling signs that Sarah recognized from her own unit's operational procedures. These were definitely American forces, probably a quick reaction force sent to investigate when her team failed to make their scheduled radio contact. Sarah stepped into the middle of the road and began signaling with her infrared strobe light. The convoy stopped immediately, and she could hear weapons being readied as the soldiers prepared for potential contact. Sarah identified herself using the proper challenge and password procedures, but she could tell the troops in the trucks were nervous about the tactical situation. The convoy commander was a young Army lieutenant who seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of what he had walked into. He had been ordered to investigate a possible ambush site and extract any survivors, but he clearly had not expected to find an active firefight in progress. His unit was not equipped for a sustained battle against entrenched enemy forces in mountainous terrain. Sarah quickly briefed the lieutenant on the tactical situation and the condition of her teammates. She emphasized that Martinez was still alive but wounded, and that he was probably running low on ammunition after several hours of intermittent contact with the enemy. The Taliban fighters were still in position around the valley, though their attention was now divided between multiple threats. The lieutenant made contact with his higher command through his radio system and requested guidance on how to proceed. The response came back quickly: extract any American survivors and withdraw from the area before the weather conditions became impossible for helicopter operations. A medical evacuation helicopter was already en route, but it would need a secure landing zone to operate safely. Sarah volunteered to guide the convoy to a position where they could establish overwatch of her team's location and provide suppressive fire while the helicopter attempted its extraction. She knew the terrain better than anyone else available, and she understood the enemy's likely positions and capabilities. The lieutenant accepted her offer, though he made it clear that his orders were to avoid unnecessary risks to his own troops. The convoy moved forward cautiously, with Sarah riding in the lead truck and providing navigation guidance. The road curved around several bends before reaching a point where they could see down into the valley where the ambush had occurred. Sarah could identify the approximate locations where her teammates had been pinned down, though she could not tell their current status from this distance. The lieutenant deployed his troops in overwatch positions along the ridgeline and established communications with the incoming medical evacuation helicopter. The pilot reported that weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly, with heavy snow and high winds that would make landing difficult even in a secure area. The extraction would have to happen quickly before the storm made flight operations impossible. Sarah watched through binoculars as the helicopter approached the valley from the south. The aircraft was flying low and fast, using the terrain to mask its approach from potential enemy observation posts. The pilot was clearly experienced in operating in this type of environment, but even experienced pilots could be defeated by weather conditions that exceeded their aircraft's capabilities. The helicopter made its approach to a relatively flat area near where Sarah's team had been positioned. As soon as the aircraft appeared over the valley, the Taliban fighters opened fire from multiple positions. Tracer rounds streaked through the darkness like deadly fireworks, and Sarah could see the pilot taking evasive action to avoid the ground fire. The army troops on the ridgeline immediately returned fire, sending suppressive rounds toward the muzzle flashes they could identify in the valley below. Sarah joined the firefight with her rifle, using her scope to identify specific targets and engage them with precision fire. The combined volume of fire from the overwatch positions was enough to force most of the enemy fighters to take cover. The helicopter pilot managed to land his aircraft despite the hostile fire, and Sarah could see figures moving around the landing zone through her scope. The crew was working quickly to load casualties aboard, knowing that every second on the ground increased their vulnerability to enemy fire. The main rotor never stopped turning, ready for immediate takeoff as soon as the loading was complete. 2 minutes after touchdown, the helicopter lifted off again and began climbing away from the valley floor. Sarah felt a moment of relief, knowing that at least some of her teammates were now safe and heading toward medical treatment. But she also realized that her own situation had just become much more complicated. The helicopter extraction had been successful, but it had also revealed the American positions to every Taliban fighter in the area. The enemy now knew exactly where the overwatch positions were located, and they would probably try to organize an assault to overwhelm the small army force. The lieutenant was already receiving reports of movement in the valley as enemy fighters began repositioning for a counterattack. Sarah helped the army troops prepare defensive positions along the ridgeline as the weather continued to deteriorate around them. The snow was falling heavier now, reducing visibility and making movement treacherous on the icy rocks. The wind was howling through the mountains with increasing intensity, and the temperature was dropping toward levels that would challenge even the best cold weather equipment. The lieutenant received new orders over his radio: withdraw immediately to avoid being cut off by the approaching storm. Higher command had determined that the tactical situation was becoming too dangerous to maintain, especially with weather conditions that would prevent any additional support from reaching them. The extraction had been successful, and there was no military justification for risking additional casualties. But, as the army troops began preparing to withdraw, Sarah made a realization that changed everything. During the firefight, she had seen muzzle flashes from positions that indicated the Taliban fighters had moved to block the mountain road that the convoy had used to reach this location. The enemy had anticipated the American withdrawal route and positioned fighters to ambush the trucks as they tried to leave the valley. Sarah informed the lieutenant of what she had observed, and he confirmed her assessment through his own surveillance. The convoy was effectively trapped. They could not advance further into Taliban-controlled territory, and they could not withdraw along their original route without fighting through a prepared ambush. The enemy had turned the tactical tables and put the Americans in their own kill zone. The storm was getting worse by the hour. Soon the mountain passes would become completely impassable, even for tracked vehicles with winter equipment. The convoy was not equipped for an extended siege in these weather conditions, and the troops were not prepared for survival in a high-altitude winter environment. They needed to find an alternative solution quickly, or they would face a choice between fighting through a prepared ambush or freezing to death on the mountainside. Sarah studied her map by flashlight, looking for alternative routes that might allow the convoy to escape the trap. There were several smaller trails marked on the map, but most of them were probably impassable for wheeled vehicles even under good conditions. The storm would make them completely impossible for anything larger than a single person on foot. One route caught her attention. A narrow trail led northeast from their current position, eventually connecting with a main supply route that would take them back toward friendly territory. The trail was marked as difficult on the map, but it might be passable for someone traveling light and on foot. It would be a dangerous journey in these weather conditions, but it might be the only option for avoiding the Taliban ambush. Sarah proposed her plan to the lieutenant. She would leave the convoy and try to reach the main supply route on foot, then guide a relief force back to extract the trapped soldiers. It was a long shot, but it was better than waiting for the enemy to either attack their positions or for the cold to disable their vehicles and equipment. The lieutenant was reluctant to approve a plan that would send Sarah alone into a blizzard in enemy territory. His orders were to avoid unnecessary risks, and this proposal seemed to violate that guidance completely. But he also understood that his current situation was rapidly becoming hopeless, and desperate situations sometimes required desperate solutions. Sarah prepared for her solo journey while the army troops established a defensive perimeter around their vehicles. She would travel light, carrying only essential survival gear and enough ammunition to handle brief contacts with enemy patrols. Her route would take her through approximately 15 miles of mountainous terrain in sub-zero temperatures with heavy snow and high winds. The lieutenant gave Sarah his radio and the proper frequencies for contacting friendly forces once she reached an area with better communications coverage. He also provided her with detailed information about his unit's location and tactical situation so she could brief any relief force on exactly what they would be facing when they attempted the rescue operation. Sarah began her movement at 0300 hours, using the darkness and storm conditions to mask her departure from any enemy observation posts. The trail she had identified on the map was even more difficult than she had expected. Within the first hour, she was climbing over rocks and around obstacles that would have been challenging even in daylight and good weather. The cold was brutal. Despite her winter gear, Sarah could feel the temperature sapping her strength and making every movement more difficult. Her water bottles froze solid within 2 hours, and she had to keep her weapon inside her jacket to prevent the moving parts from becoming too cold to function properly. Sarah pressed forward through the storm, following compass bearings and terrain features that she hoped would keep her on the correct route. Visibility was almost zero in the blowing snow, and she had to feel her way over rocks and around obstacles that appeared suddenly out of the darkness. Several times, she nearly walked off cliffs that she could not see until she was almost on top of them. By dawn, Sarah had covered approximately 8 miles of her planned route. She was exhausted, cold, and beginning to worry about whether she could maintain her pace in the face of the increasingly severe weather conditions. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the temperature seemed to be dropping even further as she gained altitude. Sarah found shelter in a small cave and tried to rest for a few hours while the storm continued to rage outside. She managed to get her radio working long enough to attempt contact with friendly forces, but the mountains were blocking her transmissions, and she could not reach anyone who could provide assistance to the trapped convoy. As she prepared to resume her movement, Sarah realized that she was facing the most challenging test of her entire military career. Everything she had learned during SEAL training was being put to the ultimate test in conditions that were designed to defeat even the most highly trained and motivated soldiers. Her teammates were counting on her, and failure was not an option. Sarah emerged from the cave into a world transformed by the blizzard. Snow had drifted against the mountainside in places where it was nearly waist-deep, and the wind continued to howl through the peaks with a sound like jet engines. The temperature had dropped to minus 42 degrees, cold enough to cause frostbite and exposed skin within minutes. She checked her equipment carefully before resuming movement. Her rifle was functioning properly despite the extreme cold, though she had to keep the ammunition close to her body to prevent it from becoming brittle. Her GPS unit had stopped working during the night, apparently a casualty of either the cold or moisture from the storm. Navigation would have to be done the old-fashioned way, using compass bearings and terrain recognition. The trail Sarah was following had disappeared completely under the fresh snowfall. She was now navigating by dead reckoning, using the mountain peaks as reference points when they were visible through the storm clouds. Progress was slow and exhausting. Each step required her to break through a crust of snow and ice that often gave way unexpectedly, causing her to sink up to her knees in the powdery snow beneath. After 3 hours of difficult movement, Sarah reached a ridgeline that should have provided her with a view of the valley system she needed to cross. Instead, she found herself looking into a wall of white that extended in every direction. The storm had intensified during the morning, and visibility was now reduced to less than 50 yards. She could barely see her own feet in the swirling snow. Sarah realized she was lost. The compass bearing she had been following should have brought her to a specific mountain pass, but the landmarks she was looking for were either obscured by the storm or she had drifted off course during the night. Either way, she was now in unknown territory with no reliable way to determine her exact location. The situation was becoming critical. Sarah estimated she had already been moving for 9 hours, and her body was showing signs of serious fatigue and cold exposure. Her hands were numb despite her insulated gloves, and her feet were beginning to lose feeling inside her winter boots. These were early warning signs of hypothermia, and she knew that her physical condition would deteriorate rapidly if she did not find shelter soon. Sarah decided to descend from the exposed ridgeline and look for better protection from the wind. Moving downhill was easier than climbing, but it also meant moving away from her intended route toward the main supply road. She would have to balance the immediate need for survival against the long-term mission of reaching friendly forces and organizing a rescue for the trapped convoy. The descent took her into a narrow valley that provided some shelter from the worst of the wind. Sarah found a cluster of large boulders that formed a natural windbreak and decided to stop there to reassess her situation. She needed to make some important decisions about how to proceed, and those decisions required clear thinking that was becoming more difficult as her body temperature dropped. Sarah forced herself to eat some of the high-energy rations she was carrying, even though she had no appetite in the extreme cold. Her body needed calories to maintain its core temperature, and she could not afford to let her energy reserves become depleted. She also melted snow in her mouth to provide her body with the water it needed to function properly. While she rested, Sarah tried to establish radio contact with any friendly forces that might be within range. She climbed to higher ground where her radio might have better line of sight to potential receivers, but she still could not reach anyone who could provide assistance. The mountains were effectively blocking all her transmissions, and she remained completely cut off from outside support. Sarah studied her map again, trying to determine where she might be based on the terrain features she could identify through the storm. The valley she was in appeared to match several possibilities on the map, but without visible landmarks, she could not be certain of her exact location. She would have to choose a direction and hope it would eventually lead her to recognizable terrain. The decision was complicated by the weather forecast she had received before leaving the convoy. The storm was expected to continue for at least another 24 hours, with temperatures remaining below -40 degrees throughout the period. These conditions would challenge even a fully equipped winter survival team operating from a fixed base camp. Sarah was carrying enough food and fuel for approximately 3 days of operations, but that calculation had been based on normal movement rates and moderate weather conditions. The extreme cold was forcing her body to burn calories at an accelerated rate, and the difficult terrain was slowing her progress to a fraction of what she had planned. She might run out of supplies before reaching her objective. The psychological challenge was becoming as difficult as the physical one. Sarah was completely alone in some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, with no way to communicate with friendly forces and no guarantee that her planned route would actually lead to safety. The constant wind and cold were wearing down her mental resistance, and she had to fight against a growing sense of despair. Sarah forced herself to focus on her training and the mission. SEALs were taught to break down overwhelming challenges into manageable tasks that could be accomplished one step at a time. She could not control the weather or the terrain, but she could control her response to these challenges. She would continue moving forward until she either reached safety or could no longer function. Movement resumed after a 30-minute rest that was probably longer than Sarah could afford but necessary to prevent her core body temperature from dropping to dangerous levels. She chose a compass bearing that should take her northeast toward the general area where the main supply road was located, even though she could not be certain of her starting point. The afternoon brought new challenges as the terrain became more difficult. Sarah found herself climbing over a series of steep ridges that required her to use both hands and feet to maintain her balance on the icy rocks. Several times she slipped and fell, once sliding nearly 20 feet down a snow-covered slope before she could stop herself with her ice axe. Each fall was dangerous not only because of the risk of injury, but also because it soaked her clothing with snow that immediately began to freeze. Sarah had to stop frequently to brush snow off her gear and clothing before it could melt and then refreeze into a layer of ice. Wet clothing in these temperatures would be a death sentence. By late afternoon, Sarah's physical condition was deteriorating noticeably. Her movements were becoming slower and less coordinated, and she was having difficulty maintaining her balance on the treacherous terrain. These were classic symptoms of hypothermia, indicating that her body's core temperature was dropping despite her best efforts to maintain it. Sarah recognized that she needed to find shelter and warm herself before attempting to continue. She began looking for any kind of natural protection that might allow her to start a fire and restore her body heat. The problem was that most potential shelter was already filled with snow, and clearing it would require energy she could not spare. The solution came in the form of a small overhang created by two large boulders that had fallen against each other. The space underneath was only about 4 feet high and 6 feet deep, but it was relatively dry and protected from the wind. Sarah crawled inside and began the process of making the space habitable. First, she spread her sleeping pad on the ground to provide insulation between her body and the frozen earth. Then, she used her survival knife to scrape together enough dry material to start a small fire. The fuel came from pine needles and small branches that had been protected from the snow by the boulder overhang. Starting the fire in the extreme cold required careful technique. Sarah used magnesium shavings from her survival kit as tinder, igniting them with sparks from her flint and steel. The magnesium burned hot enough to ignite the pine needles even in the frigid air, and she carefully built up the fire with progressively larger pieces of fuel. The warmth from the fire was immediate and dramatic. Sarah could feel circulation returning to her hands and feet as her body began to warm up. The psychological effect was almost as important as the physical one. The fire represented hope and progress in a situation that had been steadily getting worse throughout the day. Sarah used the fire to heat water for drinking and to prepare a hot meal from her survival rations. The warm food and liquid helped restore her energy and improve her mental state significantly. For the first time since leaving the convoy, she felt like she might actually be able to complete her mission successfully. While the fire burned, Sarah tried once again to establish radio contact with friendly forces. The warmth allowed her to operate the radio more effectively, and she was able to boost her transmission power by connecting the radio to her backup battery pack. She transmitted on emergency frequencies, identifying herself and requesting assistance for the trapped convoy. This time, Sarah received a faint response from what sounded like an American forward operating base. The signal was weak and intermittent, but she was able to provide basic information about her location and the situation with the convoy before the transmission faded completely. She was not certain the base had received enough information to mount a rescue operation, but at least someone now knew that American forces were in trouble. Sarah realized she could not remain in the shelter indefinitely. The convoy situation was becoming more desperate with each passing hour, and the longer she delayed, the less likely it became that any rescue operation would be successful. She would have to leave the warmth and protection of the fire and continue her movement through the storm. The decision was one of the hardest she had ever made. Every instinct told her to remain by the fire where she was relatively safe and warm. But her training and her commitment to her fellow service members demanded that she continue the mission regardless of the personal cost. The lives of the soldiers in the convoy depended on her reaching friendly forces and guiding them back to the ambush site. Sarah spent 2 hours resting by the fire, allowing her body to recover as much as possible before resuming movement. She melted additional snow to refill her water bottles and prepared extra food that she could eat quickly during brief rest stops. She also used the fire to dry some of her clothing and equipment that had become damp during the day's movement. Before leaving the shelter, Sarah tried one more time to establish radio contact with friendly forces. This time she was able to reach a different station, possibly a helicopter unit that was better positioned to receive her transmission. She provided detailed information about the convoy's location and tactical situation, emphasizing the urgency of the situation and the deteriorating weather conditions. The radio operator on the other end was professional and reassuring. He confirmed that rescue operations were being planned but warned that the weather was making helicopter operations impossible throughout the region. Ground forces would have to be used for any rescue attempt, and they would need detailed guidance to navigate through the mountain terrain to reach the trapped convoy. This information confirmed what Sarah had suspected. Her mission was still critical to the success of any rescue operation. She was the only person who knew both the convoy's exact location and the route needed to reach them safely. Without her guidance, any rescue force would be operating blind in terrain that was difficult even under normal conditions. Sarah left the shelter at 1800 hours, just as the last traces of daylight were fading from the sky. The storm had not diminished during her rest period, and, if anything, the wind seemed to be blowing even harder than before. The temperature had dropped further, and Sarah's breath formed instant clouds of ice crystals that were swept away immediately by the wind. Night movement in these conditions was extremely dangerous. Sarah could barely see where she was placing her feet, and the risk of walking off a cliff or falling into a crevasse was very real. But she could not afford to wait for daylight. Every hour of delay increased the risk that the convoy would be overrun by Taliban forces or that the soldiers would succumb to the extreme cold. Sarah used her night vision equipment to navigate, though its effectiveness was limited by the blowing snow that obscured everything beyond a few yards. She moved slowly and carefully, testing each step before committing her full weight to it. The terrain was treacherous in the darkness, with hidden rocks and ice patches that could cause a serious fall. After 2 hours of night movement, Sarah reached another ridgeline that should have provided her with a view of the main valley system. The storm was still too intense to see very far, but she was able to identify some terrain features that matched her map. She believed she was now within 5 miles of the main supply road, though the most difficult terrain still lay ahead. The descent from the ridgeline was the most challenging part of the journey so far. Sarah had to rappel down several cliff faces using rope from her survival kit, lowering herself into the darkness while wind gusts tried to slam her against the rock face. Each rappel was a calculated risk that could have ended in serious injury or death if her equipment failed or if she lost control of the descent. At the bottom of the cliffs, Sarah found herself in a narrow canyon that provided excellent protection from the wind, but also limited her navigation options. She could follow the canyon downstream, which her map indicated would eventually lead to the main valley, or she could try to climb out and maintain her original compass bearing across more open terrain. Sarah chose to follow the canyon, reasoning that the protection from the wind was worth the slight deviation from her planned route. The canyon floor was covered with snow, but the walls blocked most of the wind and made movement significantly easier. She was able to increase her pace for the first time since leaving the convoy. The canyon led her directly toward the sound of vehicles moving on a paved road. Sarah approached the road carefully, knowing that Taliban forces also used this route and that she could be walking into another ambush. She took up an observation position on high ground overlooking the road and waited for vehicles to pass so she could identify them. The first convoy that appeared consisted of 3 American military vehicles traveling with proper blackout lighting and tactical spacing. Sarah was able to identify them as friendly forces through her night vision equipment, and she prepared to make contact using proper military procedures to avoid being mistaken for an enemy fighter. Sarah approached the convoy's halt position and identified herself using the challenge and password she had memorized before leaving her original unit. The response came immediately from a vehicle commander who was obviously experienced in this type of operation. Sarah was quickly brought to the convoy commander, a Marine captain who was leading a patrol along the main supply route. The captain listened carefully as Sarah briefed him on the situation with the trapped army convoy and her own journey through the mountains. He immediately understood the tactical significance of what she was reporting and began making radio calls to higher command to coordinate a rescue operation. Sarah provided detailed information about the convoy's location, the enemy situation, and the route that would be needed to reach them. Within an hour, the captain had assembled additional forces and begun planning a relief operation. Sarah would guide the rescue force back through the mountains, using her knowledge of the terrain and enemy positions to help them avoid the Taliban ambush that had trapped the original convoy. The operation would have to move quickly before the weather made all movement impossible. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as she prepared for the return journey. She had successfully reached friendly forces and delivered the information needed to organize a rescue operation. But now she would have to guide a large force back through the same treacherous terrain she had just traversed, and she would have to do it in conditions that were continuing to deteriorate with each passing hour. The rescue force assembled by Captain Martinez consisted of 2 infantry platoons mounted in armored vehicles, a medical team with advanced trauma capabilities, and a communications section equipped with satellite uplinks that could coordinate air support if the weather improved. Sarah was impressed by how quickly the Marines had responded to her request for assistance, but she was also concerned about the challenges they would face in the mountain terrain. The convoy vehicles were designed for operations on improved roads, not for cross-country movement through snow-covered mountains. The Marines would have to abandon their vehicles at some point and continue on foot, carrying all their equipment and supplies through the same treacherous terrain that had nearly defeated Sarah during her solo journey. The logistics of moving 60 Marines through the mountains in blizzard conditions would be extremely complex. Captain Martinez briefed his company commanders on the planned operation while Sarah studied detailed topographic maps with the intelligence section. The route back to the trapped convoy would have to avoid the Taliban ambush positions that controlled the main mountain road, which meant taking the same difficult cross-country path that Sarah had used during her escape. The difference was that she had been traveling alone and could move through terrain that would be impossible for a larger force. Sarah worked with the Marines to identify alternative routes that might accommodate a company-sized force while still avoiding enemy observation and fields of fire. The solution they developed involved splitting the rescue force into smaller teams that could move through the mountains using parallel routes, then converging on the trapped convoy from multiple directions to overwhelm any Taliban fighters who might still be in the area. The plan was complicated and risky, but it was the best option available given the tactical situation and the extreme weather conditions. Each team would carry enough supplies for a 48-hour operation, including medical equipment needed to treat the wounded soldiers in the trapped convoy and enough ammunition to fight through significant enemy resistance if necessary. Sarah would guide the main assault team along the route she knew best, while experienced Marine reconnaissance troops would lead the other teams along alternate paths that had been identified from satellite imagery. The teams would maintain radio contact when possible and coordinate their movements to arrive at the objective simultaneously. The movement began at 0200 hours, with Sarah leading a 20-man team that included the company's assault specialists and most of the medical personnel. The Marines were well equipped for cold weather operations, but the extreme conditions they encountered exceeded anything most of them had experienced before. Within the first hour, several Marines were already showing signs of cold weather injuries despite their specialized equipment. Sarah set a pace that balanced the need for speed against the requirement to keep the Marines functional in the brutal conditions. She had learned during her solo journey that pushing too hard in the extreme cold would result in exhaustion and injury that could disable the entire team. The Marines needed to arrive at their objective with enough energy left to fight effectively if they encountered enemy resistance. The terrain challenges that had nearly defeated Sarah during her solo journey were even more difficult for the larger Marine team. Places where she had been able to squeeze through narrow gaps or climb over obstacles required the Marines to find alternate routes or use rope systems to get their equipment across dangerous areas. Progress was much slower than the optimistic timeline that had been established during the planning phase. Communication with the other teams became intermittent as they spread out across the mountainous terrain. The radios were functioning properly, but the mountains blocked most transmissions unless the teams were in direct line of sight with each other. Sarah knew that the other teams were facing the same challenges her group was encountering, but she had no way to coordinate timing or provide assistance if they ran into serious difficulties. After 6 hours of movement, Sarah's team reached the ridgeline overlooking the valley where the convoy had been trapped. The storm was still raging, but visibility had improved slightly as dawn approached. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see the Army vehicles in their defensive positions, but she could not determine the current tactical situation from this distance. Sarah used her radio to attempt contact with the trapped convoy, but received no response on any of the frequencies she tried. The silence could mean several things. The radio equipment might have failed in the cold, the soldiers might be maintaining radio silence to avoid detection, or the convoy might have already been overrun by Taliban forces. There was no way to know the situation without moving closer and conducting a visual reconnaissance. The Marine team leader, Gunnery Sergeant Williams, deployed his squad leaders to establish overwatch positions while Sarah conducted a careful observation of the valley below. She needed to identify enemy positions and determine the status of the trapped soldiers before committing the rescue force to a potentially dangerous assault down the mountainside. Through her scope, Sarah was able to identify signs of life around the Army vehicles. She could see movement that appeared to be American soldiers maintaining defensive positions, and the vehicles themselves did not show evidence of having been captured or destroyed. The convoy appeared to be intact but still under siege by Taliban forces who were positioned on the surrounding ridgelines. The enemy situation was more complex than Sarah had expected. Instead of the 15 to 20 fighters who had conducted the original ambush, she now counted at least 30 Taliban positions around the valley. Reinforcements had apparently arrived during the night, probably drawn by the helicopter extraction and the firefight with the Marine convoy. The trapped soldiers were now facing a significantly larger enemy force than they had been dealing with initially. Sarah briefed Gunnery Sergeant Williams on what she had observed, and they began planning their assault on the enemy positions. The Marines would have to attack uphill against prepared positions while dealing with the same extreme weather conditions that were affecting everyone in the valley. It would be a difficult fight under the best circumstances, but the storm and cold made it even more challenging. The plan they developed called for a coordinated assault from 3 directions, designed to divide the Taliban fighters' attention and prevent them from concentrating their fire on any single Marine element. Sarah would guide one team directly down the slope toward the trapped convoy, while 2 other Marine squads would approach from the flanks to engage the enemy positions on the ridgelines. The assault began with precision fire from Marine snipers who engaged the most dangerous Taliban positions from long range. Sarah watched through her scope as several enemy fighters were eliminated in the opening moments of the attack, disrupting their command and control and forcing others to take cover. The Marine marksmen were demonstrating the same kind of professional competence that Sarah had expected from elite infantry units. Sarah led her team down the mountainside under cover of the sniper fire, moving from rock to rock through the snow-covered terrain. The descent was treacherous in the extreme conditions, but the Marines maintained their discipline and followed her lead through the most difficult sections. She could hear the sounds of intense gunfire as the other Marine elements engaged enemy positions on the flanks. The Taliban fighters were well positioned and returned effective fire despite the surprise of the Marine assault. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen positions as enemy fighters engaged the attacking Marines with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. The fight was developing into exactly the kind of close-quarters battle that favored defenders who knew the terrain and had prepared their positions in advance. Sarah reached the perimeter of the trapped convoy and immediately made contact with the surviving Army soldiers. Lieutenant Peterson, the convoy commander, was still alive but had been wounded during the long siege. Most of his soldiers were suffering from various degrees of cold weather injuries, and their combat effectiveness had been significantly reduced by the extreme conditions and extended contact with enemy forces. The Army soldiers provided Sarah with a detailed briefing on the tactical situation inside their perimeter. They had been under intermittent attack for more than 18 hours, and their ammunition was running critically low. Several soldiers had been wounded during the siege, and their medical supplies were nearly exhausted. The vehicles were still functional, but the extreme cold had caused problems with engines and electrical systems. Sarah coordinated the Marine assault with the Army soldiers' defensive fire, helping to identify priority targets and coordinate supporting fires that would be most effective against the enemy positions. The combination of professional infantry units working together was beginning to shift the tactical balance in favor of the American forces, but the Taliban fighters were still holding strong positions and fighting effectively. The battle continued for nearly 2 hours as the Marines systematically cleared enemy positions around the valley. Sarah moved between different parts of the perimeter, providing sniper support and coordinating the efforts of the various American units. Her knowledge of the terrain and enemy positions from her earlier reconnaissance was proving invaluable in guiding the Marine assault teams to their objectives. The turning point came when the Marine flanking team succeeded in overrunning the main Taliban command position on the eastern ridgeline. The loss of their leadership and communications center caused the remaining enemy fighters to lose coordination and begin withdrawing from their positions. Sarah could see groups of Taliban fighters moving away from the valley, apparently deciding that continued resistance was not worth the casualties they were taking. With the immediate threat eliminated, the Marines began the process of extracting the trapped convoy. The Army vehicles were still functional, but several would need mechanical assistance to restart engines that had been damaged by the extreme cold. The Marine maintenance team worked quickly to get the vehicles operational, while medical personnel treated the wounded soldiers from both units. Sarah helped coordinate the extraction convoy that would take everyone back to friendly territory. The route would have to be different from the one she had used during her solo journey, since the vehicles could not navigate the difficult mountain trails. Instead, they would use a combination of mountain roads and cross-country movement to avoid the Taliban ambush positions that still controlled the main supply route. The medical personnel were particularly concerned about several soldiers who were showing advanced symptoms of hypothermia and frostbite. These casualties would require immediate evacuation to a military medical facility with specialized cold weather treatment capabilities. The convoy would have to move quickly despite the difficult conditions to get these soldiers the medical care they needed. Sarah rode in the lead vehicle as the convoy began its movement back toward friendly territory. She was responsible for navigation and route security, using her knowledge of the local terrain to guide the vehicles around potential ambush sites and through areas where the road conditions were passable despite the storm. The responsibility was enormous, but she felt confident in her ability to get everyone home safely. The convoy encountered several minor problems during the movement, including vehicle breakdowns caused by the extreme cold and sections of road that were blocked by snow drifts. Each problem required creative solutions, and sometimes required the Marines to dismount and clear obstacles by hand. Sarah was impressed by the Marines' professionalism and determination in the face of these challenges. After 8 hours of difficult movement, the convoy reached a major forward operating base where the wounded soldiers could receive proper medical treatment. Sarah felt an enormous sense of relief as the last vehicle passed through the base entrance, and the immediate danger was finally over. The mission had been successful, but it had pushed everyone involved to the absolute limits of their endurance and capabilities. Sarah was immediately debriefed by intelligence officers who wanted detailed information about the Taliban forces she had encountered and the terrain features that had affected the operation. Her observations would be used to plan future operations in the same area and to develop better tactics for dealing with similar situations. The information she provided would help save lives in future engagements. The base commander, a full colonel with extensive combat experience, personally thanked Sarah for her role in the successful rescue operation. He emphasized that her solo journey through the blizzard had been the critical factor that made the rescue possible, and that her actions had undoubtedly saved the lives of the trapped soldiers. The recognition was gratifying, but Sarah was more focused on the knowledge that her teammates were alive and receiving the medical care they needed. Medical personnel examined Sarah for cold weather injuries and determined that she had suffered minor frostbite on her fingers and toes, but nothing that would cause permanent damage. She had lost nearly 15 pounds during the 3-day operation, mostly due to the extreme caloric demands of operating in the brutal cold. Her overall physical condition was remarkably good considering what she had been through. Sarah learned that the helicopter extraction she had witnessed during the initial ambush had been successful in saving the lives of her wounded teammates. Rodriguez was in stable condition after surgery to repair damage from his gunshot wounds, and Martinez was expected to make a full recovery from his shoulder injury. Chief Williams had suffered a concussion and several broken ribs from the RPG explosion, but he was conscious and alert. The successful rescue operation became a case study that was used to train other special operations units on cold weather survival and small unit tactics in extreme conditions. Sarah's solo journey through the blizzard was particularly noteworthy as an example of how individual determination and technical competence could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles when lives were at stake. Sarah received several military decorations for her actions during the operation, including recognition for her marksmanship during the initial ambush, her solo navigation through extreme weather conditions, and her leadership during the rescue operation. The awards were meaningful to her, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that she had lived up to the standards expected of a Navy SEAL when it mattered most. The operation also led to improvements in cold weather equipment and procedures for special operations units operating in extreme environments. Sarah's after-action report included detailed recommendations for gear modifications and tactical procedures that would better prepare future units for similar challenges. Her suggestions were implemented across the special operations community and helped improve survival rates in subsequent cold weather operations. 6 months after the Christmas Eve rescue operation, Sarah was assigned to a new mission that would test her skills in a completely different environment. Instead of the frozen mountains of Afghanistan, she would be operating in the humid jungles of Southeast Asia, where intelligence reports indicated that a terrorist organization was planning attacks against American interests in the region. The mission briefing took place in a secure facility outside Bangkok, where Sarah met with representatives from multiple intelligence agencies who had been tracking the terrorist cell for several months. The organization was led by a former military officer who had extensive experience in guerrilla warfare and had recruited fighters from several different countries to join his cause. Sarah's role in the operation would be different from her previous missions. Instead of working with a traditional SEAL team, she would be part of a joint task force that included operators from several allied nations. The international cooperation was necessary because the terrorist cell was operating across multiple borders and using the complex political situation in the region to avoid capture. The target of the operation was a training camp located deep in the jungle where the terrorist organization was teaching advanced bomb-making techniques to recruits who would then be sent to carry out attacks in major cities. Intelligence sources had provided detailed information about the camp's location and layout, but the information was several weeks old and might no longer be accurate. Sarah spent 2 weeks preparing for the mission, studying satellite imagery of the target area and learning about the local terrain and weather patterns. The jungle environment would present challenges that were completely different from the mountain warfare she had experienced in Afghanistan. Navigation would be difficult due to the thick canopy that blocked GPS signals, and the high humidity would make equipment maintenance a constant concern. The insertion would be conducted by helicopter at night, with the team landing several miles from the target to avoid detection. Sarah would lead a 4-person reconnaissance element that would conduct surveillance of the training camp and gather intelligence about the number of terrorists, their weapons and equipment, and their security procedures. The helicopter flight to the insertion point took place during a thunderstorm that made the landing extremely challenging. The pilot had to use night vision equipment to navigate between tall trees while dealing with severe turbulence and heavy rain. Sarah was impressed by the skill required to place the aircraft precisely on a small clearing that was barely large enough to accommodate the helicopter's rotor diameter. Sarah's team moved immediately into the jungle after the helicopter departed, using night vision equipment to navigate through vegetation so thick that visibility was limited to just a few feet, even with artificial enhancement. The team moved slowly and carefully, stopping frequently to listen for signs of enemy activity or other helicopter operations that might indicate they had been detected during the insertion. The jungle was alive with sounds that were completely unfamiliar to Sarah. Birds, insects, and small animals created a constant background noise that would mask the sounds of human movement, but also make it difficult to detect approaching enemies. The team had to learn to distinguish between natural sounds and those that might indicate the presence of hostile forces. Navigation through the jungle required constant attention to compass bearings and pace counting, since the thick canopy made GPS reception impossible most of the time. Sarah used traditional land navigation techniques that had been taught during her basic training but which she had rarely needed to use in the modern military environment where electronic systems were normally available. After 6 hours of movement through the jungle, Sarah's team reached a position overlooking the terrorist training camp. The facility was larger and more sophisticated than the intelligence reports had indicated, with several permanent buildings and what appeared to be an extensive system of underground bunkers and tunnels. Sarah conducted a detailed surveillance of the camp using high-powered optics, counting personnel and identifying the locations of weapons, communications equipment, and other important targets. The terrorist organization had obviously invested significant time and resources in developing this facility, and it was clear that the training program was more advanced than intelligence agencies had realized. The number of people at the camp was also higher than expected. Sarah counted at least 60 individuals who appeared to be trainees or instructors, along with a security force that was equipped with military-grade weapons and appeared to be well-trained in defensive tactics. Any assault on this facility would face significant resistance from fighters who were prepared for combat. Sarah's team spent 3 days conducting surveillance and gathering intelligence about the daily routines and security procedures at the camp. They observed training exercises that included instruction in explosives handling, weapons tactics, and what appeared to be planning sessions for specific attacks against civilian targets. The intelligence that Sarah's team gathered was transmitted back to the Joint Task Force headquarters using encrypted satellite communications. The information painted a picture of a sophisticated terrorist organization that was much more capable and dangerous than previous assessments had indicated. The decision was made to expand the planned operation and include additional forces to deal with the increased threat. Sarah was tasked with conducting a closer reconnaissance of the camp's defenses to identify the best approach routes for the assault force. This mission would require her to move much closer to the terrorist positions, increasing the risk of detection but providing information that would be essential for planning the attack. The close reconnaissance mission took place during heavy rain that provided excellent concealment, but made movement through the jungle even more difficult. Sarah had to crawl through thick vegetation for several hours to reach positions where she could observe the camp's defensive positions without being detected by the sentries who were posted around the perimeter. The information Sarah gathered during her close reconnaissance revealed that the terrorist organization had prepared for the possibility of an attack by government forces. They had established interlocking fields of fire around the camp perimeter, dug fighting positions that would provide protection from small arms fire, and created escape routes that would allow key personnel to evacuate if the camp came under attack. Sarah also discovered that the terrorists were using sophisticated communications equipment that would allow them to coordinate their defense and call for reinforcements from other cells in the region. Any assault on the camp would have to move quickly to prevent the terrorists from organizing an effective defense or escaping to continue their operations elsewhere. The assault on the terrorist camp began before dawn, with simultaneous attacks from 3 different directions designed to prevent the terrorists from using their prepared escape routes. Sarah led one of the assault teams, using her detailed knowledge of the camp layout and defensive positions to guide the other operators through the most effective approach routes. The terrorists responded to the assault with determined resistance, using their prepared fighting positions and knowledge of the local terrain to maximum advantage. The battle quickly developed into a series of close-quarters firefights as the assault teams worked to clear individual buildings and bunker systems throughout the camp. Sarah's marksmanship skills proved crucial during the urban warfare phase of the operation. She was able to engage terrorist fighters who were firing from concealed positions, often at ranges where other team members could not identify the targets. Her precision fire eliminated several key defenders and allowed the assault teams to advance through areas that had been heavily fortified. The operation succeeded in capturing most of the terrorist training camp, but several high-value targets managed to escape through the jungle during the confusion of the battle. Sarah was assigned to lead a pursuit team that would attempt to track down these escaped terrorists before they could reach safe haven in neighboring countries. The pursuit phase of the operation required Sarah to use tracking skills that had been only briefly covered during her SEAL training. The escaped terrorists were experienced in jungle warfare and had left minimal signs of their passage through the thick vegetation. Sarah had to rely on subtle indicators like disturbed vegetation, partial footprints, and broken branches to follow their trail. The chase continued for 4 days as Sarah's team followed the escaping terrorists deeper into the jungle. The terrorists were moving quickly and appeared to know exactly where they were going, probably following a predetermined escape route that had been planned in advance. They were also taking measures to conceal their trail and mislead their pursuers. Sarah's team finally caught up with the escaped terrorists at a river crossing where the fugitives had been forced to wait for transportation. The resulting firefight was brief but intense, with both sides using automatic weapons at close range in thick jungle vegetation that limited visibility and fields of fire. The operation concluded with the capture of the remaining terrorist leadership and the destruction of the training camp facilities. Intelligence materials recovered from the camp provided information about planned attacks in several countries, allowing security forces to prevent multiple terrorist operations that could have resulted in significant civilian casualties. Sarah's performance during the joint operation earned recognition from several allied nations and led to her assignment to a new position within the Special Operations community. She was selected to join an elite unit that specialized in counterterrorism operations and would be responsible for conducting similar missions around the world. The new assignment would take Sarah away from traditional SEAL team operations and into a more specialized role that would require additional training in languages, cultural awareness, and advanced technical skills. She would be working with some of the most experienced operators in the Special Operations community on missions that would often require her to operate independently in hostile territory. Sarah's reputation within the Special Operations community had been established by her actions during the Christmas Eve rescue and reinforced by her performance in the jungle operation. She was now recognized as an operator who could be trusted to handle the most challenging assignments and who would find a way to accomplish the mission regardless of the obstacles she faced. The transition to her new role required Sarah to attend several specialized training courses that would prepare her for the types of missions she would be conducting. The training included advanced language instruction, cultural immersion programs, and technical courses on sophisticated equipment and weapon systems that were not available to conventional military units. Sarah approached her new responsibilities with the same determination and attention to detail that had characterized her previous service. She understood that the missions she would be conducting would be even more challenging than those she had faced as a SEAL team member. But she also knew that her experience and training had prepared her to meet these new challenges successfully. The Special Operations community was a small and close-knit organization where reputation and performance were the only measures that mattered. Sarah had proven herself through her actions in extreme conditions, and she had earned the respect of her peers and superiors through her technical competence and unwavering commitment to mission accomplishment. As Sarah prepared for her new assignment, she reflected on the path that had brought her to this point in her career. She had joined the military with a desire to serve her country and had discovered that she possessed abilities and determination that allowed her to excel in the most demanding military specialties. Each mission had taught her something new and had prepared her for even greater challenges. Sarah's experience during the Christmas Eve rescue had taught her that individual determination could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles when the stakes were high enough. The jungle operation had shown her that the same principles of careful planning, technical competence, and aggressive execution applied regardless of the environment or the specific nature of the threat. The lessons Sarah had learned would serve her well in her new role, where she would face challenges that were different from anything she had encountered before. She would be operating in environments where the margin for error was even smaller and where the consequences of failure could have strategic implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Sarah looked forward to the new challenges that awaited her, knowing that she had been prepared for them by some of the best training and most demanding operational experience available in the modern military. She was confident in her abilities and committed to maintaining the standards of excellence that had been established by the operators who had come before her in this specialized community. 2 years after joining the elite counterterrorism unit, Sarah received her most challenging assignment yet. Intelligence agencies had identified a terrorist cell that was planning a coordinated attack on multiple targets during the upcoming Olympic Games. The operation would require infiltrating a heavily secured compound in Eastern Europe where the terrorist leadership was meeting to finalize their plans. The mission briefing took place in a classified facility where Sarah met with intelligence analysts who had been tracking this particular terrorist network for over a year. The organization was sophisticated and well-funded, with connections to state sponsors who provided them with advanced equipment and training. They had successfully carried out several attacks in different regions and had demonstrated a high level of operational security that made them difficult to penetrate. Sarah's role in the operation would be to infiltrate the compound during a winter storm that was forecast to hit the region in 3 days. The weather would provide cover for her approach, but would also create additional challenges for extraction if the mission encountered problems. She would be operating alone, with backup support positioned several miles away due to the sensitive political situation in the target country. The target compound was located in a mountainous region that was covered with snow for most of the winter months. The facility had been designed as a private retreat for wealthy individuals, but intelligence reports indicated that it had been converted into a secure meeting place for terrorist operations. The compound included several buildings surrounded by high walls and sophisticated security systems. Sarah spent a week studying satellite imagery and intelligence reports about the compound's layout and security procedures. The facility was protected by a professional security force that included former military personnel with extensive training in close protection and defensive tactics. The security team used rotating patrols, electronic surveillance systems, and trained guard dogs to protect the perimeter. The approach to the compound would require Sarah to cross several miles of mountainous terrain in winter conditions while avoiding detection by local security forces and civilian populations. She would carry specialized equipment for the infiltration, including climbing gear, surveillance devices, and weapons that could be concealed during her approach to the target. The insertion was conducted by a civilian aircraft that appeared to be carrying legitimate passengers, but actually contained Sarah and her support equipment. The flight landed at a small airfield approximately 30 miles from the target compound, and Sarah immediately began her movement toward the objective using a motorcycle that had been pre-positioned by intelligence operatives. The motorcycle allowed Sarah to cover the initial distance quickly while maintaining the appearance of a civilian traveler. She wore clothing that was typical for the region and carried identification documents that would pass casual inspection if she encountered local authorities. The cover story was that she was a journalist traveling to interview local residents about economic conditions in the region. As Sarah approached the target area, she abandoned the motorcycle and continued on foot through forested terrain that provided concealment from observation. The weather was beginning to deteriorate as the predicted storm system moved into the region, bringing heavy snow and strong winds that would complicate her approach, but also provide additional cover from the compound's security systems. Sarah reached an observation position overlooking the compound just as darkness fell and the storm began in earnest. Through her night vision equipment, she could see the security patrols moving around the perimeter according to predictable patterns that matched the intelligence reports. The electronic surveillance systems appeared to be functioning normally, but the heavy snow was beginning to interfere with some of the cameras. The compound's layout was exactly as described in the intelligence briefings, with the main meeting facility located in the center building surrounded by accommodation blocks and support facilities. Sarah could see lights in several windows and observed vehicles parked in areas that suggested the terrorist leadership had already arrived for their planned conference. Sarah's infiltration plan called for her to breach the compound's perimeter during a gap in the patrol schedule that occurred every 45 minutes when the guards changed shifts. She would have approximately 8 minutes to cross the open area between the perimeter fence and the main building before the next patrol began its circuit. The approach to the perimeter fence required Sarah to cross 200 yards of open ground that was covered by security cameras and motion sensors. The heavy snow provided some concealment, but she would still need to move carefully to avoid triggering the electronic systems that were designed to detect intruders attempting to breach the compound's defenses. Sarah used techniques she had learned during her advanced training to defeat the motion sensors and avoid the camera coverage zones. She moved in short rushes between areas of natural cover, timing her movement to coincide with wind gusts that would mask any sounds she might make. The storm was intensifying, which helped mask her approach, but also made movement more difficult. The perimeter fence was 12 feet high and topped with razor wire, but Sarah was able to bypass it using a drainage culvert that passed under the fence line. The culvert was partially blocked with debris and ice, requiring her to crawl through a space that was barely large enough to accommodate her body and equipment. Once inside the compound, Sarah moved carefully toward the main building where the terrorist conference was taking place. She could see security guards at the entrances, but the storm had caused them to seek shelter in positions that provided less comprehensive coverage of the building's approaches. Sarah used climbing equipment to ascend to the second floor of the building through a window that was not covered by the security cameras. The room she entered was apparently used for storage and was not occupied during the evening hours. She moved carefully through the building, avoiding areas where she might encounter security personnel or building occupants. The terrorist leadership meeting was taking place in a conference room on the ground floor of the building. Sarah was able to position surveillance equipment that would record both audio and video of the proceedings without being detected by the participants. The intelligence gathered from this surveillance would be crucial for preventing the planned attacks and disrupting the terrorist network. Sarah spent 4 hours in the building, gathering intelligence about the terrorist organization's plans and capabilities. She was able to photograph documents, record conversations, and identify key personnel who were attending the meeting. The information she collected exceeded the expectations of the intelligence agencies who had planned the operation. The extraction phase of the mission began when Sarah detected increased security activity around the compound. It appeared that the security force had discovered some indication of her presence, though they had not yet determined her exact location within the building. She would need to leave immediately before they could organize a comprehensive search that would inevitably lead to her capture. Sarah's exit from the building was more challenging than her entry had been, since the security force was now actively looking for signs of intrusion. She had to wait for an opportunity when the guards were distracted by their search activities before she could move to her planned extraction point. The escape route took Sarah through the same drainage culvert she had used during her infiltration, but Now the passage was partially flooded with ice-cold water from the melting snow. She had to crawl through the flooded tunnel while carrying all her equipment, emerging on the outside of the compound soaked and extremely cold. The storm was at its peak intensity as Sarah began her movement away from the compound toward the extraction point where her support team was waiting. The wind was blowing at over 60 miles per hour, and the snow was falling so heavily that visibility was reduced to less than 10 feet, even with night vision equipment. Sarah's navigation during the extraction movement was complicated by the storm conditions and the need to avoid the search teams that were now looking for her throughout the area. The compound's security force had contacted local authorities, and additional personnel were being brought in to conduct a systematic search of the surrounding terrain. The movement to the extraction point took Sarah 6 hours instead of the planned 3, as she had to take a circuitous route to avoid the search teams and deal with terrain that had become much more difficult due to the accumulating snow. Several times she had to take cover and wait for search parties to pass before she could continue her movement. Sarah reached the extraction point just as her support team was preparing to abort the mission due to the deteriorating weather conditions. The helicopter pilot reported that conditions were at the absolute limit of what was safe for flight operations, but he was willing to attempt the pickup if Sarah could reach the landing zone within the next 30 minutes. The final phase of Sarah's escape required her to cross an open valley where she would be visible to any search teams that might be operating in the area. The storm provided concealment, but it also made movement extremely difficult and increased the risk that she might become lost in the whiteout conditions. Sarah made the crossing in 25 minutes, guided by GPS coordinates and her own navigation skills. She reached the landing zone just as the helicopter appeared through the storm, flying at extremely low altitude to avoid detection by radar systems that might be operated by local security forces. The helicopter extraction was complicated by the severe weather conditions and the small size of the landing zone, which was barely large enough for the aircraft to land safely. The pilot had to make several attempts before he was able to place the helicopter in a position where Sarah could board without being struck by the rotor blades. Once airborne, the helicopter flew at low altitude through the mountain valleys to avoid detection by air defense systems as it headed toward friendly territory. The flight took over 2 hours due to the need to follow a circuitous route and the reduced speed required by the storm conditions. Sarah's mission was declared a complete success after intelligence analysts reviewed the information she had gathered during her infiltration of the terrorist compound. The intelligence provided detailed information about planned attacks that allowed security forces to prevent multiple terrorist operations and arrest key members of the organization. The operation also provided intelligence about the terrorist network's funding sources, communication methods, and operational procedures that was used to disrupt their activities across multiple countries. Sarah's successful infiltration had dealt a significant blow to a sophisticated terrorist organization that had been responsible for numerous attacks against civilian targets. Sarah received recognition from multiple intelligence agencies for her role in the successful operation. The mission had demonstrated her ability to operate independently in extremely challenging conditions while gathering intelligence that had strategic importance for national security. Her performance reinforced her reputation as one of the most capable operators in the special operations community. The success of the mission led to Sarah's assignment to an even more specialized role within the intelligence community. She would be responsible for conducting similar operations against high-priority targets that required the unique combination of technical skills, physical capabilities, and operational experience that she had demonstrated throughout her career. Sarah's new responsibilities would take her around the world on missions that would often require months of preparation and could last for extended periods in hostile territory. She would be working with the most advanced equipment and techniques available to the intelligence community, often testing new capabilities that had never been used in operational environments. The transition to her new role represented the culmination of Sarah's military career and her evolution from a traditional SEAL team member to one of the most specialized operators in the counterterrorism community. She had proven herself through a series of increasingly challenging missions that had tested every aspect of her training and capabilities. As Sarah prepared for her new assignment, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. Each mission had built upon the lessons learned from previous operations, creating a foundation of experience that allowed her to handle challenges that would have been impossible for less experienced operators to overcome. Sarah's career had demonstrated that determination, technical competence, and unwavering commitment to mission accomplishment could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Her success in the most demanding operational environments had established her as a role model for other operators and had contributed to the development of new techniques and procedures that would benefit the entire special operations community. The legacy of Sarah's service would continue to influence the special operations community long after her active duty career had ended. Her experiences and the lessons learned from her operations would be studied and applied to future missions, helping to prepare the next generation of operators for the challenges they would face in an increasingly complex and dangerous world. Sarah looked forward to the challenges that lay ahead, knowing that her experience and training had prepared her for whatever missions she might be assigned. She remained committed to the highest standards of professional excellence and to the defense of the values and interests that her service was designed to protect.